Hello everyone, and thank you for joining our bite-sized virtual seminar today. It's heartwarming to see so many familiar faces in the room, our wonderful donors, advocates, partners for the future. It's also lovely to see some brand new faces. Thank you for joining us, whether you're joining in the Zoom room or via Facebook Live. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mara Jean Tilley and I have the great privilege of heading up the Garvan Research Foundation, which is the marketing and fundraising arm of the Garvan Institute of Medical Research. Today, I'll be your MC. Before we get started, I'd like to pay my sincerest respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which the Garvan Institute and St Vincent's Hospital are located. We recognise their continuing connection to land, to waters and culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today, we've got a fantastic talk for you, a talk about our bones. Our bones are in a continuous state of remodelling throughout our lives, where old and damaged bone is replaced by new bone. As we age, this rebuilding process can become unbalanced, leaving bones thinner and more fragile and more susceptible to fracture. When somebody has osteoporosis, even a slight bump can lead to a major fracture. In Australia, 2 in 5 women and 1 in 4 men over the age of 50 will experience an osteoporotic fracture. Worldwide, an osteoporosis-related fracture takes place every 3 seconds. And frighteningly, once you've had a fracture, you're more likely to incur a second one, and it also increases your risk of dying prematurely. Today, I'm joined by one of Garvan's absolute superstars, clinician scientist Professor Jacqueline Center. Jackie is an endocrinologist and an epidemiologist and head of the Clinical Studies and Epidemiology Lab here at the Garvan Institute. Jackie's one of the principal researchers of the Garvan-run Dubbo Osteoporosis Epidemiology Study, the longest and largest osteoporosis study in the world that's been tracking the bone health of thousands of Dubbo residents and their families since 1989. A very powerful study, an incredible cohort of generous people participating in research out at Dubbo. So today Jackie's going to talk to us about fractures, about prevention and her latest work, which is changing the lives of Australians living with osteoporosis every day. The format for today includes a presentation from Jackie, followed by the opportunity for you to vote on some pre-submitted questions. If you find that you have pressing questions that are not addressed through today's presentation, please do enter those questions at the end of the presentation into the seminar survey, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. So with my great pleasure, I now welcome and introduce Professor Jackie Center. Jackie, over to you. Hello, Jackie. Thank you so much for joining us. It looks like you're here on site in the Garvan building.
Yes, you can see my messy office.
It looks like a very busy person's office, which indeed you are. So look, thank you so much for taking time out both from your research laboratory and from your patients to speak to our special Garvan family members today. So before I invite you to kick off with your presentation, you've been studying bones for a very long time, and through your research, a number of new discoveries have been made that have changed our whole idea of the bone ecosystem. What got you excited about working in bone in the first place, and what's changed since you first started your career to now?
Well, actually, I got into bones a little bit by serendipity. When I was thinking of doing a PhD, I was interested in epidemiology, so interested in the course of disease, what happens, what are the risk factors and what are the outcomes. And really there was not a lot of epidemiology happening in Australia and certainly in Sydney. And a few years prior to starting the PhD, Professor Eisman had set up the Dubbo osteoporosis study, and that was really why I came into osteoporosis. I didn't think I would last there, but obviously 25 years later, I'm still there.
Amazing, amazing, and making enormous contributions.
So I guess one of the things that is really exciting and what has changed since I started, and you mentioned some of this in your introduction, is that bones are not just a scaffold. They are alive. And in fact, they interact with other organs in the body. There's hormones, they have influences on the brain, on the metabolism. And that's really exciting, because I think bones are really now really the center. And I think some of what we found out about what happens after a fracture sort of starts to make sense in that context.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jackie. Over to you.
Okay. Okay, you able to see that?
Perfect. Thank you, Jackie.
Okay. So I'll start off, and we're going to just talk about a little bit of a quick run through over the last 25 years or so about osteoporosis and fracture, and why should we be interested. So firstly, what is osteoporosis? Osteoporosis is where you have low bone mass and deterioration of bone, resulting in increased fragility and an increased risk of fracture. And here you can see a picture of normal bone on the left and osteoporotic bone on the right. And you can see that the scaffolding in between the struts in the bone, some are certainly smaller, and they've broken, and that's why the bone is much more likely to fracture. And what is an osteoporotic fracture? Well, it's really a fracture, any fracture that occurs when you wouldn't expect a young, healthy person to fracture. So if you fall over, even if you fall down a couple of stairs, a young, healthy 20-year-old would not be expected to fracture. And if you do, that is a low trauma or osteoporotic fracture. And as you heard previously, it's common. And in women and men aged over 60, 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men will sustain an osteoporotic fracture in their lifetime. Now, the important thing is it's not just in the very elderly. We often think of osteoporosis as a disease of old women. Well, it's not. It occurs in younger women and men, but we are talking over the age of 50 or 60. Now, interestingly, there are more hospitalizations and there's greater cost for osteoporosis in women than breast cancer in women. So it's not something that has no significance in general health schemes. But unfortunately, it's not widely recognised as a problem. And in fact, less than 30% of women and less than 20% of men with osteoporotic fractures are on appropriate treatment. So having said that, let's have a deeper dive into bone. And this was put together by one of the other animation specialists at the Garvan. And I will start the video. So as I mentioned, our bones are more than just a scaffold. And there are lots of many different types of cells on bone. Here you can see the strut, the scaffold, and here you can see a blood vessel coming through bone. And the bony matrix relies on protein, calcium, and vitamin D to keep it strong. But as we age, bone starts to deteriorate, and you will see the deteriorating bone on your right. And it will resemble the first picture that you saw. And that's why there's increased risk of fracture. But the good news is that with medication, the bones may regain some density, and certainly we know that medication decreases fracture risk. Oops, sorry. So now let's go on to the Dubbo study. So just to give you a very brief idea about the study, there are around 2,200 women and almost 1,800 men who were recruited in 1989 and have been followed up until the present, roughly every couple of years. And they get extensive interviews and measurements done asking all about their medication and lifestyle, whether they've fallen. We take a measure of how strong their bones are, which is a bone density test. That's a test that can easily be done and is done in the community. We measure strength and sway, and we collect any fractures that occur in the whole community, and also mortality, all the death data. And in that way, because it's been such a long study, and because we both have women and men, we've been able to find out a lot about what are some of the risk factors for fracture, but also what happens after fracture. And that's where I'm going to concentrate on in the rest of this talk. But just briefly, some of the important findings from this study is about fracture risk. And so I just will take you through this slide slowly. You can see a graph here of women on the left and men on the right. And the fracture risk is on the y-axis and age is on the x-axis. And first thing you can see is that there are more fractures in women than men. And so out of every 3 fractures, about 2 occur in a woman and 1 will occur in a man. So it still is significant in men. And if you concentrate, the green represents hip fractures, and you can see there's an exponential increase in hip fractures with age, both in women and in men. The orange represents vertebral or spine fractures, and similarly, there's an exponential increase with age in women and men. And we know that age is a strong risk factor for fracture, and that's partly because, as you saw previously, the bone density tends to deteriorate, and it does more quickly in women than men. But importantly in this slide, you'll also see these yellow bars, which are non-hip, non-vertebral fractures. So any other fracture of the arms, any other fracture of the legs, of the ribs, and you can see how common they are in the younger women and men. And in fact, they're almost flat. And that's really important because these were fractures that were previously ignored until we found some really interesting data from the Dubbo study. So if we go on to the next slide, what I'm going to show you is what happens now after your first fracture. When I started the research, fracture was sort of the end point. We were worried about osteoporosis because of the risk of fracture, but now we know that fracture leads to some more serious consequences, including, as Mara Jean mentioned, another fracture and also increased risk of dying prematurely. But here you've got on this slide the first fracture, and now these are all fractures grouped together, women in pink and men in green, again age on the x-axis, and you can see that in general fracture risk increases with age. But once you've had a first fracture, that's the risk of a second fracture. So it increases at least 2-fold for women for every age group, but for men, it jumps 3- to 4-fold. So that once a man has had their first fracture, their risk of a second fracture is equivalent to that of a woman who's also had their first fracture. It's almost as if the first fracture declares itself to someone who's vulnerable to having more fractures. One of the other findings from the Dubbo study, which was really the first, was this reduced survival post-fracture. Now, this is a bit of a complicated slide, and I'll take you through it slowly. It's a Kaplan-Meier plot, and I'm just showing you here women and women aged between 60 and 74. And the y-axis is survival, and the x-axis is time. And at the beginning here at 0 time, everyone starts off at 1 or 100% alive. And then, as you'd expect, with time, people start dying. Now, so what we have here in the white is the general population. This is what you'd expect the mortality to be for the whole population. And you can see that after about 15 years, about 35 to 40% of the population would have died at the time we did the study. And these colours represent different types of fractures. So in light blue are minor fractures, which have the same mortality as the general population. And here we're talking about hands, fingers, toes, ankles, wrist. What you have in the green are the hip fractures. So you can see they have the greatest mortality. You can see how quickly it drops off, so that by 5 years, about half the population of people with hip fractures have died. But what is important is in the orange and yellow are the other fractures. Orange are spine fractures, and yellow are all the other, what we called major fractures, or things like upper arms, other leg fractures, pelvis fractures, rib fractures. So really common fractures that are also associated with a reduced survival. But the good news, and we also found this from Dubbo, is that there seems to be an improvement with treatment. Not only does treatment decrease risk of subsequent fracture, but it seems to improve survival. And this is not a randomized study, so there's a lot of caveats about this. But even so, what you can see here, for instance, in the white is the general population, the mortality. It's the same sort of curve as the previous graph. In the orange are people with fractures who have not been treated, and in the green were people with fractures who've been treated. And you can see that essentially their mortality went back to that of the general population. That is a bit of an overcall, that we wouldn't see that in because of the biases in this type of study. But even in a randomized control study, there is an effect on mortality. So where have we gone and what have we learnt? The Dubbo study has been fantastic, and we've learned so much, and it's changed the way we've thought about what happens after fracture. But also in the last few years, I've gone on to collaborate with a number of people internationally with much larger data sets so that we can interrogate the data a bit more. They may not have the same detail as Dubbo, but we can find out other things as well. And so some of the important points that we've learned are that another fracture, a subsequent fracture, further increases mortality, that the increased mortality is related to all fractures that are close to the body centre, as I mentioned before. The risk of mortality is actually highest in the first few years after fracture, and the risk, the excess mortality, so the risk lasts about 5 years after the fracture, and then if you survive that, you go back to the general population. It lasts a bit longer for hip fractures, but for most of the other fractures, it seems to be about 5 years, with the greatest risk in the first couple of years. We've also found out that other medical conditions independently add to the risk of mortality on top of the risk from fracture. We know now that poor physical function increases the mortality risk, and possibly a deterioration in physical function also increases the risk. We also have found out that rapid bone loss increases the mortality risk, which is really interesting because it leads us to think about some mechanisms about how bone may increase mortality. And also that the treatment effect on mortality is in large part due to the reduction in bone loss. But what we still don't understand is, how do fractures result in premature mortality? You know, it's easy to understand why someone with a hip fracture may die soon. And in fact, you know, 20% of people with hip fractures die after a year. But why would an upper arm fracture, for instance, lead to premature mortality? Now, with this next slide, I just want to show you a little bit how complex this whole question is. And here we're combining the type of fracture and underlying health. So again, this slide is complex, but I'll take you through it slowly. Similar sort of slide with everyone with survival and everyone starting off at 100% alive, and then there's time on the x-axis. And we have two things going on. we have fracture and type of fracture. So the dotted lines are no fracture, then the dashed lines are an arm fracture, and the continuous lines are a hip fracture. And so you can see the dotted lines do better, the dashed lines are then slightly worse, and the worst is the hip fracture, which is similar to what I showed you before. The colours are comorbidities, or the number of underlying health conditions. And this could be something like diabetes or heart disease or lung disease, common major health conditions. And you can see that green are no comorbidities, blue is 1, and red are 2. So with increasing number of comorbidities, as you'd expect, the mortality increases. But what is interesting is that if you combine the comorbidity and the fracture type, there is an additive effect. So if you look here, this blue dashed line represents a humerus fracture. The green straight line represents a hip fracture. But someone with a humerus fracture and 1 comorbidity in blue has the same mortality as someone with a hip fracture, but no comorbidities. So they interact. And that is what we're trying to understand now in collaboration with people from overseas with large data sets, we also using a randomized trial in other populations, and also working with basic biologists to understand why or how a fracture results in this 5-year increased mortality. We know it interacts with baseline health status, with comorbidities and physical function. We know that there's there's probably functional decline after a fracture. There's possibly worsening comorbidities after a fracture. How these interact and how the role bone plays is what we're trying to understand. So as a quick Cook's tour or summary, these are some of the just important messages. Low trauma or osteoporotic fractures are common. They occur in men and women. Once you've had a fracture, it increases the risk of another fracture. We know that fractures are associated with decreased quality of life, physical impairment, and premature mortality. We know that underlying health conditions and physical function impact the outcome following fracture. We still do not know how a fracture results in premature mortality. And further research to understand the how will lead to intervention targets. But the bottom line is, don't ignore a fracture. They must not be ignored. And I'd just like to acknowledge everyone from the Garvan team, Kate Patterson, who put together the animation slide, and some of these really talented researchers, and I just mentioned Dana Blick and Tak Tran in particular, to Janet Waters and all the participants in the Dubbo study, our international collaborators, and of course funders.
Amazing, Jackie. Thank you so very much for that fantastic, frightening, but in a good way, I think, because as we've said, you know, people, it's a very misunderstood vital organ, and clearly it has huge ramifications if it's not cared for and treated appropriately. So we're going to go to some polling questions now. So a little bit of audience participation. We invite the audience to vote on which questions they would like addressed first or most. And while we wait for that to happen, Jackie, I just had one question regarding the data for the individuals they've had a fracture, and if they can survive for 5 or more years, they typically return to having a similar risk to the general population or the control group. Is that
unless they have another fracture?
Fantastic.
If they have another fracture, that risk goes up again.
Okay. And so it would be really important for those individuals to adhere to the treatment regimes that they're clinicians recommend for them.
Absolutely, because we know that the risk of another fracture is also in the first few years after the first fracture. It's sort of the greatest risk of another fracture and of the mortality is in the first couple of years after a fracture, but generally for the first 5 years or so after a fracture, and then it starts to go down. Yeah.
I guess it makes sense, doesn't it? You know, even if you've just sprained your ankle and you're getting that ankle to work, you know, at its full strength, you're much more likely to have another trip.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it has something to do with confidence as well. You know, if you fall, it's you do lose your confidence.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Because I'm going to ask you another question. How do you balance seeing patients and running a very busy laboratory?
Not easily is the short answer. And my family would probably have something to say about that. But what's good about having the both is that you see what's actually happening with patients, and it leads you to ask the questions. And so then you can actually, you've got some questions that you can then actually use the data to answer. And it goes the other way around too. So from the Dubbo study, for instance, we've developed a fracture risk calculator, which uses some of the important risk factors to give someone an idea of what their fracture risk is. And I use that risk calculator in my practice. So it works both ways. So
The virtuous circle.
Yeah.
Amazing. We've just got the results coming through on the poll now, so bear with me, Jackie. Oh, there's some very clear winners here. Okay, the first one, Jackie, please, is can a change in diet be effective for preventing or slowing the progress of osteoporosis?
The answer is yes, it can, to some extent, and depending on where you are. So we know the bones need calcium, particularly for a growing bone, but also women after the menopause in particular. We know the bones need protein, and particularly as you get older, often, you know, when people eat less, they don't focus so much on protein. And you do see this in, for instance, people who are vegans, for instance, who may not have a lot of protein or calcium. I see clinically people with osteoporosis. So changing diet to include enough calcium and protein can help. If you can't get enough calcium in your diet, you can take a calcium supplement.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jackie.
But I will just say that it will not, for someone who has a normal diet and who has enough calcium and protein, they're the main things that I would really point to. You still will not stop the bone loss that happens after menopause, for instance, once you lose estrogen. So you can do that to help, but you may need other things as well.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you. How important is exercise for those with osteoporosis?
Exercise is important. It's important in a couple of ways. And perhaps one of the most important ways is really to reduce your risk of falls, because you very rarely fracture without a fall. And so what we found with exercise is that you need a balanced program. So you have to have falls prevention in there. Weight bearing is important. So unfortunately, things like swimming and cycling actually don't do anything to your bones, but it's resistance exercise. It's a combination of resistance exercise and increased loading, as well as eccentric forces through the bone, because the bone responds to stress. And so if you jump, for instance, and jump off a block or hop from one side to the other, you're putting different forces on the bone. Now, clearly it needs to be modified depending on, you know, your physical ability and how old you are and things. But there are some programs that are around that can help strengthen the bones. Walking is good and healthy, but doesn't do a lot for your bones, unfortunately.
So you need to have a little skip midway on that nice long walk.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. It's thought that females are more prone to developing osteoporosis. Why is this the case? I think we've touched on this, but perhaps you could extrapolate.
Yeah, so at least partly because at the menopause we get a sudden loss of estrogen. And so that causes, so with that, we get quite a rapid bone loss. For around, everything seems to be around 5 years, but if for around 5 years or so after the menopause, you get a rapid bone loss, which then tends to continue at a slower rate. And men also get bone loss, but not at such a fast rate. So that's at least one of the reasons. There's probably something in there to do with bone size, because women's bones are smaller than men. And women tend to fall more. So it's probably a combination of a number of factors. But as I mentioned before, once a man's had a fracture, they've put themselves at that high risk category, similar to a woman with a fracture.
Yeah, no, absolutely fascinating, Jackie. Now, I appreciate we are over time, so apologies to those of you in the Zoom room or on Facebook who need to get back to work. A huge thank you to you, Jackie. Absolutely riveting presentation. Clearly, we all need to think and talk more about our bones and how to keep them healthy. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of our wonderful attendees for coming. You are going to have the option shortly to complete a survey on your experience of today's presentation, and we would warmly welcome all your feedback, full and frank. We have an opportunity to continue improving the way that we run our virtual seminars, as well as a desire to start hosting live seminars also, in addition to the continuation of virtual seminars when it is safe to do so, which we hope will be in the foreseeable future. But all of your feedback really does help us. If you felt inspired by today's presentation, please do consider your continued support of the Garvan Institute of Medical Research, philanthropic funding, donations, Partners for the Future. You are absolutely what accelerates our research discoveries, and we thank you with our deepest gratitude for everything that you do for us. Share the seminar with a friend. Sign up to the newsletter if you're interested to be involved beyond today. We'd love to see you again. So that's it, everyone. Jackie, thank you so much, and wishing everyone a lovely day. Stay well.
Thanks.